Okay, hi everyone, and thank you very much, Catriella, for the warm welcome and for inviting me to have the privilege of joining this Tanu program at its inception, which is very exciting. I just want to spend a minute introducing me. I and my wife Judith over there. Judith has come with me. She's heard all of this before, but I noticed Catriella did something which we English would never do in her talk, which was she gave a high five to someone. In case I need to give a high five with an audience of mostly women, I would have to do it with David or with Steve or with Judith. So,
I can do it on your behalf.
okay. So let me just say we are Olim Chadashim. We came to Zichron 2 months ago, and we are loving it. And thank you all for welcoming us. Let me just tell you why I am risking talking about such a difficult subject as the problem of evil. Just a sentence about my background, which will help explain the approach. So I was a community rabbi for 33 years in the UK. For the last 30 of them in Hampstead Synagogue in West Hampstead in London. As the Times newspaper once put it, the West in West Hampstead is silent. So we like to call it the Hampstead Synagogue. And while doing that, I had a sideline academic career. And you mentioned Rabbi Sachs before, Catriella, who was a wonderful mentor. And he was actually a role model in how to be an active rabbi while doing academic work. We had what for me was a seminal conversation in my life when I first began and asked him how he managed to keep doing philosophy while being a community rabbi. He said there were 3 ways of doing it. You do 2 hours a day, you do 1 day a week, or you do 1 week every 8. So I chose the 1 day a week, which was Wednesday. And that's so wonderful to be here on a Wednesday. Most Wednesdays in London, I was in the British Library in Euston, which was great. So my interest in the problem of evil and in philosophy of religion more generally is as a result of being a committed Jew, working in the community, and also having interests in academic interests in philosophy. Now in Israel, I've tried to reverse things, so I kind of dropped most of the rabbinate stuff and doing the academia more. So my normal job now is I'm a research fellow at Haifa in the philosophy department, and as I said, have let the rabbinate mostly go, so that when Judith and I went on our first or second visit to Moed, Rabbi Yair Silverman, who I've known for many years, came over to me at a certain point and said, "You have the look on your face, Michael, someone who's thinking, this is not my problem." And it's just wonderful to be at the back of the shore. It's just great. It's just great. So we're trying to reverse things. So, and again, following Rabbi Sachs' example, I did my PhD, actually London University, at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, which Jews in London know by its alternative Rashi Tevot, School of Anti-Semitism. Okay. So that's the background to what limited qualifications I hope I have to try and say something about this really vexing subject. So this source page gives you the main headings of what I'm going to talk about. So you can hopefully track what I'm saying. So now I'm the 4th of 4 wonderful talks this morning. I mean, the first 3 have been wonderful. This is the 4th of 4 talks. And it gives you the main headings, and there's a few sources. As please God, the series go on, we'll have many further sources. Okay, so first of all, what is the problem of evil? What is the problem of evil? The problem of evil, sometimes referred to as the problem of suffering. Some contemporary philosophers prefer one, some the other, but I'll use them pretty interchangeably. The problem of evil, as it's been framed in the Western philosophical tradition, especially in contemporary philosophy, is if God has the attributes traditionally ascribed to him by Judaism, Christianity, probably Islam as well, and other faiths, if God has the traditional attributes of, including other attributes, so these are the key three for our purposes: omnipotence, he's all powerful; omniscience, he's all knowing; and moral perfection, as philosophers like to say sometimes, omnibenevolence, perfectly morally perfect. If God has those attributes, then how come there is evil in the world? How come there is evil in the world? And especially, how come there is evil in the variety and the depth and the intensity and the distribution, which we'll come back to, that it is? It ought not to be possible. If God has the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, there ought not to be any evil in the world. As Hume puts it in his dialogues, Scottish philosopher, 18th century David Hume, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, wonderful book and beautifully clear. Hume says in that book, if God is omnipotent, then he is powerful enough to stop all evil. So if there's evil, that suggests perhaps that God is not omnipotent, he's not all powerful, there is evil, but he hasn't got the power to stop it. If he is omniscient, then he knows about all the evil in the world. So we haven't got the get out of saying, well, he doesn't know about some of the evil in the world, and that's why he's not preventing it. And if he is morally perfect, then he has no desire to inflict evil or suffering, or allow evil or suffering to affect anyone for any reason which isn't fully morally justified. So God doesn't have any motivation. So if we've got a God who can do anything, can stop anything, can make anything happen, knows about everything going on in the world, and has no motivation to allow unjustified evil, then it looks like we are snookered, as they say. And I don't know if that's too much of an English metaphor. That there is no way then of explaining apparently how it is that we have evil and suffering in the world. Difficult problem, and that problem has been presented in the contemporary philosophical discussion really in two main forms. What was popular until the late 1970s was the logical problem of evil, meaning philosophers would use it as an argument for atheism. They would say there is a logical contradiction. Since if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly beneficent, omnibenevolent, and yet there is evil in the world, which is a fact which we can't deny, then there can't be a God, or at least there can't be a God with those traditional attributes. And therefore it's a flat out logical contradiction. So that's called the argument from evil, sometimes using the problem of evil as an argument, deploying it as an argument against the existence of God. Since the late 1970s, largely we've got a somewhat softer version called the evidential problem of evil, which is what we'll be focusing on mainly. The evidential problem of evil says it's not that the existence of evil in the world disproves the existence of God, but it counts as good evidence against it. It's strong evidence against it. It's prima facie. It makes it seem less likely than otherwise would do that God exists. You might say, there's evidence for God's existence. There's, absolutely standard argument for the existence of God in philosophical tradition also appears in our Makor, the teleological argument, the argument from design. The world shows features of very intricate design in many respects. So that seems to point to what, the analogy of the watch and the watchmaker. If you have a watch which works well, then presumably there was a watchmaker who had the intelligence to put it all together, make it work as it does. So the world seems to be like that in many respects. So you may say there are other arguments which suggest that God does exist. The problem of evil, the evidential argument from evil says that may be true. There may be other evidence for that seems to point towards the existence of God, but the existence of evil seems to be strong evidence against it. Okay. What I'm going to do today, folks, but this is rather a typical session because it's the introductory one. So, I'm going to make about 38 introductory points in the next 50 minutes, but we need them. And then, please God, from next time, if there's anyone still with me, then we will go into the source more directly. So, we need to set out the groundwork. So, evidential problem of evil. When we say evil, suffering, contemporary philosophical discussion tends to distinguish between two types of evil, moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is the evil that human beings do to each other. So think murder, robbery, rape, etc. And natural evil, we mean natural disasters, we mean earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, disease. That distinction between moral and natural evil has come under some pressure recently because several philosophers have pointed out that you can't always draw such a sharp line between the two. An earthquake will affect a location with poor housing worse than it will a wealthier society which has taken precautions and has built buildings which can withstand some of the effects of earthquakes. When I started working on the most recent iteration of this project, the wildfires in LA had just begun, and many scientists attributed it to climate change, which was a result of human misbehavior with the environment. So it's not always clear that there is an absolutely bold line between them, but the distinction still survives in that there are definitely things which happen in nature, in the world of nature, for which human beings are not responsible, which cause terrible suffering. And of course, you can't which continental philosophers might say is more relevant and speaks more deeply to the dilemmas of human existence, which analytic philosophers would sniffily say it's not rigorous enough, it's not clear enough. So my alma, I'm very fortunate to my undergrad at Cambridge, where there was nearly a riot in the Senate House when they tried to give Derrida an honorary doctorate, and people said, oh, it's not clear. And we had a wonderful lecturer there. It's a very pucker Englishman. And he said, students come to me and they say, why don't we study European philosophy here? And I say to them, we do. We study Plato. So there's that divide. There's that divide between the two traditions. So what I was trained in analytic philosophy, that's the approach I'm using, but actually I'm not going to be sniffy. There are very important approaches in continental philosophy. We'll come across Emmanuel Levinas later in the course, and they have important things to say. But I think that the analytic philosophical approach is one valuable approach. So I'm looking for something which is defensible in analytic philosophy and also which is grounded in Jewish sources. Now that may not be so easy, because there may be trade-offs, as David Schutz points out in an article. I may find something which is very well rooted in the Jewish tradition, but it's hard to defend philosophically. Or, for example, I'll give you an example. Sajid Gaon, who deals with the problem of evil in the Book of Theodicy's Introduction to Eov, and also in Emunot V'Dayot, the book Beliefs and Opinions, Sajid Gaon focuses a lot on the concept of nisayon, a test or trial, in explaining the problem of evil, and particularly the sufferings of Eov. And yet that doesn't have much resonance in a contemporary philosophical discussion. All kinds of approaches, as we'll see in a contemporary philosophical discussion, but that doesn't loom large. So it's been hard to develop philosophically, even though it's well rooted in the Makorah. I just have to say parenthetically, I last night I saw the interview with Bar Kupperstein, who said that one way that he coped for some of the time in his captivity was imagining what his mother would say. It was beautiful footage of his reunion with his mother and his father, his family. And he thought his mother would say to him, this is a nisayon. Hashem is there, he's with you, but he's testing you. And he obviously found that he said it gave him a lot of strength. So you get these approaches which are there in our tradition, but haven't been developed much philosophically. And the other way around, you can get approaches which appear in the philosophical literature, but not so much in ours. But you can also get benefits. So for those of you who make it through, please go to session 5 or 6. There's an approach in contemporary philosophical discussion called divine intimacy theodicy, a very counterintuitive idea, which is that God makes us suffer because it's a way of bringing about closeness between us and God. And some earlier work, I've linked that up with the doctrine of Yisurin Shel Ahava, which appears in the Gemara in Brachot, the sufferings of love. And I think if you read divine intimacy theodicy and Yisurin Shel Ahava together, you can see that actually they help each other. For example, Chazal, already in the Talmudic discussion in Brachot 5a to b, which is the longest discussion of the problem of evil in the whole of Chazal, there in that discussion, they are already anticipating objections which help divine intimacy theodicy. So it's a very interesting relationship. But that's really what we're after. We're after doing the best we can from the point of view of our Makorot and the philosophical tradition. Okay, so back to onto that's 1 and 2. On to number 3 of 9, so that's good. So 23 minutes gone, and we're on 3 of 10. So a tiny bit behind, but it's okay. So I've got to tell you, my shul in London Hampstead, it was the only shul I've ever seen. Doesn't have a clock on the wall facing me. I've got used to that. But anyway, I will stick to time. Okay. So I said the most important thing to say, perhaps I probably will tell difficult it is, how intractable it is, how problematic it is clearly reflected in our own tradition. And so here's I'll go through it quite quickly because translations all there for those who prefer it. Plus, it's a well-known Gemara. Kiddushin 39b, Lamed Amud Bet. There's very similar language at the end of Chulin, or Kuf Mem Bet 142a in Chulin. So Rabbi Yaakov Omer, Ein lecha kol mitzvah shektuva b'Torah shebatan schara b'tzidah she'ein tchiyat hametim tluya ba. Whenever you have a mitzvah in the Torah which mentions what the reward is, you're always going to need to bring in tchiyat hametim, by which he means, more generally, I think not particularly tchiyat hametim, resurrection of the dead, but olam haba, some future kind of superior life to this world. That's all. You're always going to need that to explain why the Torah can be confident in promising that reward. Kibud Avim, famously, Kibud Avim, fifth commandment, honoring parents. The Torah says in the Aseret HaDibrot, so that your days are prolonged, so that things are good for you. And Shiluach HaKan, and in the sending away of the mother bird, so you come across, you're in the woods, you come across a nest, and you want to take the eggs, you have to shalach it ta'im. The Torah says you have to send away the mother bird, and the Torah promises long life as a reward for that. I'll just summarize it so that we catch up on ourselves time-wise. Then you've got the famous story. This Gemara is famous, be very familiar to many people. So there's a person to whom his father said, here I'll give you one new thing on this famous Gemara. You ask people about this Gemara, they'll say, oh yes, the child whose father told him to climb up a tree and he fell down. The Gemara doesn't say that. Look, he said, Haresha Amar Lo Aviv. There was a person whose father said to him. There's no indication that it's a child. And it's Alei Labirai, goes up a building, to get the chicks which his father had asked him, and he doesn't fall down the tree, he falls down off the building. Anyway, there is a Midrash Rutz Rabbah, which has again, not a child, it has a man climbing a tree. If I remember correctly, it's a date palm. He climbs a date tree, and then he doesn't fall off it. A snake bites him on the way down. So I think all these, as often happens in the popular imagination, in many fields, all these things get welded together, and we end up with a child falling down the tree. But it's just as a dinner party thing. It's worth saying,
When you want to bring up evil in the world, and heresy.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so this person tragically falls down. And what about the Torah promising reward for Dafka, these two mitzvot? Supposed to have a long life, doesn't have a long life. So what's going on? So Rabbi Yaakov answers, no, it's referring about Olam Shekolot Tov, Olam Shekol Aruch. It's talking about a future world, Olam Haba, or this world after Chiyat Hamitim. It's talking about something else. So we need to, that's how we answer it. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef adds the codicil to this. Mali Darshe Acher Lahaikra, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Bate. Had Acher, Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, the famous heretic, that starts off as a great rabbi, became a heretic. Had he heard this teaching of his own, actually Rabbi Yaakov is his own grandson, the son of his daughter, Lo Chata, he wouldn't have sinned, he would have stayed on the straight and narrow. He would have stayed on the derech. He wouldn't have gone OTD had he known this teaching of his grandson, that it's not referring to this world, referring to the world to come. And what was it that caused Acher to sin? So one opinion is this is why he became why the Tana Acher went off the derech. It was because he saw the problem of evil in action. He saw there was a reward which the Torah promises for something, and someone's clearly not getting it. And how is this reconcilable with the Torah's promises? And that's why Acher went off the derech. There is another explanation, and others say he saw chutzpit hamatuga. Chutzpit, the translator, interpreter, was executed by the Romans, and he sees his tongue being dragged along by a pig. And it's and that's what and how could this happen to someone such a great teacher of Torah? And that's what okay. But the point is, according to some opinions, and also opinions like this in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud in Chagiga as well, according to some opinions in both Talmuds, Bavli and the Yerushalmi, Babylonian and Palestinian, we see opinions that the problem of evil was the cause of Achez's heresy. So that is we know from the earliest, from already from Chazal millennia ago what a serious problem it is. Ramban, I haven't brought it here, but in the introduction to Sefer Eov, his commentary on Job, Ramban says the problem of evil has caused many people throughout the generations to come to the conclusion that there's no God. So even though Ramban has a theodicy, it comes later in the course, please God, Ramban recognizes how difficult a problem it is. And we're coming to our own era, Rav Soloveitchik, Kol Dodi Dofek, translated by Lawrence Kaplan's Fate and Destiny. Of course, that's not a literal translation, although the voice of my beloved Knox. Is it still on the syllabus in the Dati Leumi schools? Apparently, it used to be anyway. I don't know. They told us here in Israel.
Not anything that anybody's mentioned to me,
Right.
but they don't tell me what's on them.
Right. 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 So they used to tell us as kids that that Kol Dodi Dofek was up because it is a theological elaboration of the importance of Midzinat Israel. Non-messianic, interestingly enough, and that's another whole talk. It doesn't say it's Reshit Smichat Gulatenu. It says it's significant in all kinds of other ways, six ways. There's 6 knocks, one of which, what came up in one of your sessions, I think, Catriella, one of it is it stopped the Christians being able to say, the witness, look how persecuted the Jews are, they're wandering Jews forever. Now we've come back and they can't say that anymore. And that's a huge dimension of theological significance of the state of Israel. Anyway, in Kol Dodi Dofek actually is very largely about the problem of evil, particularly in the light of the Shoah. And the very first sentence here, translated by Kaplan, I'm on page 2 now. One of the darkest enigmas with which Judaism has struggled from the very dawn of its existence is the problem of suffering in the world. That very first sentence of Kol Dodi Dofek, Rabbi Sachs in The Great Partnership, no question so lacerates the heart of faith as does this. And many of us feel that. I think, well, personally, for me, it does. And I think for a lot of other people, there are all kinds of intellectual, spiritual challenges to faith. But this one is a tough one because it's so, well, lacerating Rabbi Sachs. I mean, it's so ubiquitous and we encounter it all the time. That's how recognition of how difficult the problem is. Okay, moving on to point 4 of 10 with 32 minutes gone. So I want to make another distinction: macro versus micro. So macro. What I'm trying to do in this series is ask what approaches are out there which are grounded in Jewish tradition, which are philosophically defensible, which are a good way of trying to make progress on the problem of evil. That's the macro. So looking in large terms, in general, what would be a Jewishly faithful and philosophically robust approach to evil? What I'm not trying to do is the micro, and I think many analytic philosophers, not Jewish, stress this in their own way as well. I'm not trying to explain any particular instance of evil that happens. I think any respectable philosopher accepts you can't do that. You can't do that. So we won't come out with an answer. Take an example which is uppermost in all our minds of why the 7th of October happened and the suffering. So to try and come up with an answer for any particular instance of suffering is just, you'd need to know exactly how God runs the universe, and if you can't find an answer for any particular thing. We just haven't got that. We just haven't got that kind of knowledge of how things operate. What we can do is we can say in general, some of the types of suffering which are tragically manifest, we can think of reasons why in general God might allow that kind of suffering. But just hubris to, I believe, to try and answer any question in whatever way. I mean, the problem is when people do try to just to explain particularities of evil, they tend to do it badly. But there are two problems. One is doing it badly, but there's also a problem with doing it at all. I think, but that whole enterprise doesn't work. I believe, and also this overlaps with the question of sensitivity. If you're giving an explanation, God allowed 7th of October to happen because of this, this, and this, displays a terrible lack of sensitivity. If you are talking to people who are affected by it directly or even indirectly, that is just not morally a thing that one should do. Laura Ekstrom, who's a Christian philosopher, in her book God, Suffering, the Value of Free Will, is a nice quote from her: alleged divine justification, so often the last thing a suffering person needs to hear. With respect to offering theodicies will come across, they'll loom very large in the course. Theodicies is theories as to why God would allow suffering. With respect to offering theodicies to those in the midst of enduring pain and loss, just shut up remains to my mind decent advice. Everyone, as you're facing someone who, God forbid, any kind of serious suffering or tragedy, they don't need you to explain to them why God might have allowed it to happen. And Ekstrom doesn't know this, but in reading Sefer Eov, I was delighted to see that Eov says exactly this, chapter 13, verse 5. Says to his friends, who, if only you would just shut up. As Moshe says to Bnei Yisrael at the splitting of the Yam Suf, just keep quiet. And indeed, we get again, I haven't brought it here because we haven't got time, but if you look in Bava Metzia, Nun Chet Amud 58b, Bava Metzia, a famous Gemara which criticizes Job's friends for committing the sin of Ona'at Devarim, of oppressing people with words, even though they're being very frum and they're saying to Eov, God is entirely just and he never makes people suffer for no reason, and you must have done something wrong, and etc. So even though they're being very frum, it's Ona'at Devarim to theodicize in front of someone who's suffered. They don't need to hear that. They don't need to hear that. They need you to be there, but they don't need to hear that. Okay. On to number 5. Yeah, so I talked about I said that we're going to be drawing on analytic philosophy and trying to make progress on the problem of evil. You might say, isn't that okay? So you're not going to theodicize in front of someone who's suffered. But to try and give a philosophical explanation of suffering at all seems to be a bit flat-footed and insensitive. It's all this range of suffering and depth of suffering in the world. And if you come up with some reason why God might allow it to happen, isn't that just, even if you're not saying it in the presence of the sufferer, isn't that just a very flat-footed, clumsy way of dealing with the problem? And the most obvious, and there in modern Jewish writing, actually, Rabbi Norman Lamb and Rabbi Sachs actually both really adopt this line, and they advocate what's probably the most obvious alternative for dealing with suffering. The most obvious alternative to philosophy stroke theology would be literature. So, instead of trying to answer why God might have allowed the Shoah, why not read Elie Wiesel's Night, La Nuit? Someone who's not trying to answer the question of, well, how can the good God allow this to happen? Not to do it in such a clumsy way. Use literature which is symbolic, which has different levels, which is nuanced. Maybe that's the only way that we can understand evil in some way, but don't try and put it in these mathematics, a logical contradiction here. That's not the way. That's taking a sledgehammer to a problem of immense depth and subtlety. So there are those who say, you know, shouldn't we do philosophy about this at all? The reason I still want to do philosophy about it, and many others do, is that, first of all, the way in which our tradition, as we'll see in the next in the coming sessions, please, the way in which our own Jewish tradition has dealt with the problem of evil has largely been philosophical and theological. There are many other approaches, but that has been the main approach. So it's certainly going in the footsteps of tradition to take that approach. Also, John Hick points this out. I'm going to keep throwing books out. If anyone wants, I can get in touch with you. Feel free to send you. I'm very happy to send you the references. Evil and the God of Love by John Hick is a great book on, and very accessible, on the problem of evil. John Hick says in Evil and the God of Love, I'm approaching the problem of evil from a philosophical perspective, because not to do so would be to give up on the vocation of philosophy and theology. This is clearly the problem of how a good and all-powerful God can allow suffering to happen in the world is quite clearly a philosophical and theological problem. And a philosopher or theologian can't duck out of it and say, well, we're not doing philosophy or theology about this. You can't, that's just to abandon the trade. I think sensible philosophers and theologians will say we can't abandon it. We will take that approach, but it's one approach among many. And analytic philosophers will say continental approach is valid, and literature is valid, and other approaches are valid, multiplicity of approaches. But I think it is legitimate to use the analytic philosophical approach, as long as we recognize there are constraints on it. So one of the important constraints I'll mention is mentioned by the unlikely named but brilliant Eleanor Stump, who is I was about to say Stump as in cricket, but that would just for most people that does. So Eleanor Stump is a brilliant Christian philosopher. She says if you're going to do philosophy, which she does, if you're going to read one thing in the general literature, Eleanor Stump's Wandering in Darkness, Oxford University Press 2010. She has 4 chapters on Tanakh. Well, 3 chapters on Tanakh, 1 on the New Testament. She has a chapter each on the Akedah, on Eov, and on Shimshon. Absolutely brilliant. And so she does follow a philosophical approach, but she says if you're being a philosopher approaching the problem of evil, try and explain evil. Don't explain it away. Don't explain. You never explain. You always have to confront the nastiness of evil, the evil of evil, as it were, head on. Okay, so doing it with care. Hopefully, the philosophical approach is a legitimate one. Okay, it's good. On to number 6 of 10, 6 of 9. 6 of 9. Yeah. Okay.
So can I just ask a
Sure.
question, the philosophy versus
Yes.
literature? Like,
Yes.
Are you saying like literature is better, is a way of approaching, is a way of defining it, or a way of contending with it?
Right. So I'm not. So you wouldn't use literature to try and answer the philosophical problem of evil, but you, as a way of understanding evil more deeply, understanding the problem more deeply.
Through character development and just.
Is
that the point of the Tanakh? Like the Tanakh episodes? Okay.
The point of the Tanakh episodes, I think, is there can be all kinds of. You might get implicit answers to the problem of evil in some episodes. That's actually what Stump argues, for example, about Shimshon. She kept saying, I'm not giving a theodicy on the basis of a complex biblical narrative, but she says Shimshon can never have attained these spiritual heights without the suffering he went through. I mean, I'm just flattening it out a bit.
I see.
So that you might get other. Rabbi Sachs has a wonderful line that not all theology about suffering in Judaism is theodicy. So you can do theology. So when we have the Gemara in Brachot about the end of Brachot about Rabbi Akiva, being his famous Gemara about being tortured to death by the Romans, there is not a word of addressing the problem of evil there. Rabbi Akiva never says, or his Talmidim never say, how can God allow this? That's in Menachot. The Nagamar in Menachot, famously, where Moshe seems to, that's the so
God says,
God says be quiet. Yes, so that's the Menachot. But in Brachot, the focus seems to be or what is really Ahavas Hashem. It's really Rabbi Akiva's heroism and love of Hashem in going through this, and that seems to be, so it's a kind of a
prestige.
But and it's kind of a template of what to aspire to in coping with please God the far lesser suffering in our own lives. So different things from literature, but the key is they're all multiple approaches, and they're all legitimate. They do different things.
And then you've got that Eli Lama Zaftani.
Yeah.
Bit I won't quote.
Yeah. Tehillim. Yeah. So that's asking. Yeah.
Tehillim, Jesus.
Yeah. So that's asking the. That's asking the. Actually, you know what? Thank you, Sarah. You know what? That's helped me to jump. Now we're going to get ahead. This is going to be clever because we're going to do a bit of number 7 now, and then we've saved time. If you look at the top of page 4, I was quote from Martin Buber. So I told you there'd be some continental. Martin Buber in The Eclipse of God, top of page 4. Buber says, "How is a life with God still possible in a time in which there is an Auschwitz in Auschwitz? The estrangement has become too cruel, the hiddenness too deep. One can still believe in the God who allowed these things to happen, but can one still speak to him?" So what's the problem there? It's relationship. How can I, Lama Zaftani, it's not, I don't believe you exist, God, but why have you abandoned me? How can we have a relationship anymore? So there are different, so that's very much, I think that's exactly the point you're making, Sarah. Okay. You might, or again, clearing all the ground, trying to show that the whole project that I'm trying to pursue the next 9 sessions is legitimate. You might say, a chutzpah. How can you, we're Hashem's creatures, and He put us here, and He is the Ribono Shel Olam. And how can we even raise these kinds of questions? Isn't it wrong to do so? And you all know the answer, which is we see people raise it. Heroic figures raising it in Tanakh and again. Avraham Avinu and Yirmiyahu and Chavakuk, etc. So we see it done a lot, and it's summed up a bit by Eliezer Berkovitz in With God in Hell, it's page 3. Occasionally God reveals his approval of those who contend with him, as he did in the case of Job. He rejects the well-meaning defenders of his justice towards Job in the words which he addresses to Eliphaz and Temanite. Eliphaz being one of the three friends. Eliphaz, Sophar, Bildad, and then there's Elihu. My wrath is kindled against thee and against our 2 friends. If you've not spoken me the thing that's right, as my servant Job, that you mentioned before, even though they have given from solutions to the problem of Job's suffering, Hashem is angry with them at the end of the book, whereas Job, the questioner, the accuser, is recognized as God's true servant, and even Hashem tells Job to daven. Eliphaz and Spencer asked Job to daven for them. So just appealing to our tradition, Hashem, as it were, he can handle it. He doesn't mind people confronting him with the problem. And there is a very useful paragraph on this connection by Christian philosopher William Hasker, which I think is very helpful to Jewish people as well. And this is the second thing. So you might say, how can you raise the problem of evil? So how can you challenge God and say you're not being just? That's one question. But you could go beyond that and you could say theodicy. Okay, now let me now say 30 seconds about the term, even though we'll mostly be focusing on it in future. So theodicy, from the Greek theos dike, justifying God. Milton puts in Paradise Lost, justifying the ways of God to men. Theodicy attempts to explain how it is that God, who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, would allow evil in the world. What justifies God in doing that? Yes, so typically a theodicy will say, without giving the content, just the structure, it will say there is a greater good, greater than the suffering, that was attainable by this suffering, and there was no other way of getting it, or the suffering was the best way of getting it, or all other ways would have involved equal or worse suffering. Something like that's the structure of the theology. We'll come up with some benefit that couldn't have been gained without it. That's the theodicy. So you might say, how can you even offer a theodicy? What's the problem with it? So Haskell, talk of the justification of God may well make us uncomfortable, but this is not, and that's the whole idea of theodike, justifying God. It's not our, we might think it's not our place to justify God, but this is not what is going on when we set about constructing a theodicy. God is the holy and righteous one, the one before who we ourselves will be judged, not someone subject to our judgment. The fact remains, however, that the proponents of arguments from evil have alleged that the phenomena of evil in the world are in conflict with the presumed existence of such a good, wise, and powerful being, so that faith in such beings' existence can be maintained only in defiance of reason. That's how people use the argument from evil, particularly in the logical, to say, is it all right?
Time's up.
Well,
Time's up.
Time's up.
Right. You can continue.
We'll continue.
Yes.
Okay. So once the existence of evil has been used,
I know, I thought maybe there's something in it.
once the existence of evil has been used as an argument against God's existence, then Haskell says the believer has a choice: withdraw from the discussion. Oh, wonderful, thank you. Okay, we've solved that. That evil has been removed, thank you. Or attempt to answer the charges. The theodicist chooses the latter option, but with the realization that it's not God who needs to be defended. Rather, we need to defend the coherence of our religious worldview in the face of charges that it cannot be rationally believed. God does not need a theodicy, but we do. So, and I think that really echoes something we'll come to, please, in session 10, which is Ramban talking about the importance of theodicy. Come up with a justification that's plausible, so that your own faith and those of people you discuss the problem of evil with will be strengthened. But God doesn't need the justification. So I think, again, the approach of theodicy, asking the question, is legitimate. Okay, number 7 of 9. Okay. Another distinction important to make before we get going on the main track, please God, next time. I'm not going to say anything about animal suffering. And the excuse I've got for that is, number one, some of what we say about human suffering will be mutatis mutandis, as they like to say in Latin, given the appropriate necessary alterations will be applicable to animal suffering as well. Also, as Peter van Inwagen is a great contemporary analytic philosopher, Christian, he says human beings and animals are so different from each other that it's quite plausible that God would have entirely different general reasons for allowing human suffering and allowing animal suffering. They're still different despite the huge genetic. So it reminds me of the best man speech that I ever heard. It was where the best man stood up and he said, you know, human beings share 98.4% of their DNA with a chimpanzee, but looking at the bridegroom, you'll agree with me, that's just an average. But anyway, so even given the very similar DNA with some of the animals, there may be complete. So I'm not going to say anything about animals, but obviously one could have a whole course about that. Even more important, again, an objection to clear to the whole project before we start. You might say to me, it was very nice. You're talking about the problem of evil, but you haven't dealt with how the problem of evil is framed in our classical Jewish sources. In our classical Jewish sources, we don't see people saying, how is it that the God who's all powerful, all knowing, and all good can allow evil in the world? We say, why is there a tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo? How come there are righteous people who to whom evil things happen, and bad people to whom good things happen, or in general their lives go well? In other words, the Jewish framing of the question of evil is about distribution. We're not asking why there is evil. We're not even suggesting that evil implies anything about the non-existence of God. It's about God's justice. We understand, we accept God exists, we accept the existence of evil, but why is it distributed in this way? And that tends to be the Jewish way of putting it. And we see that again and again. We see it in Tanakh. That's how Yirmiyahu and Habakkuk, some places raise the problem. That's the famous Gemara, which we'll come back to in a future session. Please go Brachot, Daf Zayin, Brachot 7a, about Moshe Rabbeinu wants to know why is it that Sadik V'Ralo, Rasha V'Tovlo, and according to Rabbi Michael, God refuses to tell him. But that's the way in which we tend to put the question. Nevertheless, during the rest of the course, I'm going to focus on the philosophical way of asking it, because I think that is what primarily bothers most contemporary thinking Jews. I think when we hear of a tragedy or experience a tragedy, La Alena, that's happened, we tend not to think, oh, why, that person's so good, why is it happening to that? So, but we tend to think, why is it happening at all? The very existence of suffering, alongside a God who has the attributes we believe him to have, I believe ultimately that's what bothers us the most, and that's why I'm going to focus on that. But it's very important to be aware that in Jewish also we focus on distribution a great deal. Okay, now thanks to Sarah, we finished section 7 already. So section 8, theodicies and defense. So I introduced the term theodicy before. So what I'm going to be doing in the course is talking about 4 major approaches within contemporary philosophy to dealing with the problem of evil, and bringing in our Jewish Makorot under those categories. So there's theodicies we've mentioned, there's defenses, there's skeptical theism, there's anti-theodicy. Skepticalism and anti-theodicy are further down the road. What's the difference between a theodicy and defense? Important to find out. So I like to say that theodicies and defenses are theodicy and defense are siblings. Theodicy is the tougher, more assertive sibling, and defense is the more diffident. So theodicy will say, this is the reason why God allows suffering. God allows suffering to make you a better person, for example, soul-making theodicy, which we'll come to. And so on. And a defense will say, for all we know, it may be that God allows suffering or much suffering or suffering of a particular type because it tends to make us a better person. So defense is tends to be more modest. And then you get pressure on this distinction as well. Just one, so David Schutz again says, well, if you can only think of one defense in any particular situation of evil, then effectively that's a theodicy. You might be saying, for all we know, yeah, well, to give me some other scenarios. If you can't suggest multiple defenses, effectively what you're offering is a theodicy. But the distinction is accepted by most and is still there. Finally, 9 of 9 with 4 minutes to go. We could let you off, if you've been at all interested, we could let you all off and me off 9 future sessions by questioning the attributes of God. So the whole problem of evil only comes about because we've said that God is omniscient and omnipotent. But if we can undermine any of those, then we're home and dry. God doesn't stop all evil because although he knows about it all and he's very good, he's not powerful enough to, or he is good enough to and he knows he doesn't know about it. He's powerful enough and he's good enough, or he's not right. So what I want to argue in a nutshell is that if we're going to try and do this from within the matrix of traditional Jewish sources, we're not going to get very far because by and large, tradition asserts that Hashem is omnipotent. I know these phrases come in later, these omnipotent, etc. But by and large, we say Hashem is all powerful. So I say God can do anything he wants. By and large, we see that repeated again and again in Tanakh, etc. Chazal, omniscience, also, and moral perfection as well. But let me just say a brief word. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Of course. Let me just say a brief word about some fascinating issues which arise around these, despite the fact that I don't think we're going to make any progress by saying, well, we can make a Jewish case that God doesn't have one of these attributes. So in terms of omnipotence, should mention Rambam's negative theology. Rambam in the guide thinks that, strictly speaking, you can't say anything positive about God. You can only speak negatively. He's not such and such. So then you can't even get the problem of evil going. So you can't say that God is omnipotent or omniscient. Okay, big another series, probably best given by someone else. Truths of logic and maths. Can God make 2 + 2 = 5? Interestingly enough, the mainstream position in medieval Jewish philosophy, and Sajid Gaon says this explicitly, is no, he can't. God cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. He said it's impossible, and the impossible is nothing. So it's not compromising God's omnipotence. God is omnipotent, but things which can't be done logically are nothing, and therefore to say God can't do them isn't to undermine his omnipotence.
And Rambam would say it's untrue. So you can't do anything that's untrue. In other words,
Right.
2 + 2 is 4. That's the truth.
That's the truth, right? Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Yeah, and it's actually what philosophers call a necessary truth. Yeah, you can't. It couldn't be otherwise. We could have a world in which we had falafel, not the delicious wraps, but we couldn't have a world in which 2 + 2 = 4. Yeah, so they're just interesting issues about omnipotence. Again, bottom line, tradition seems to be pretty consistent in attributing omnipotence to God. Omniscience, God knowing everything. We should mention very briefly foreknowledge and free will, as Rambam raises famously in the 5th chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah. We've got free will. Rambam says in chapter 5, it's a cardinal principle of Judaism. He says, so how come if God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow, and if he knows it, it must be true and it must be happening, then surely I haven't got a choice about it. So Rambam addresses that issue very briefly, and he basically says, don't worry about it. God's knowledge and our knowledge are different from each other, and God's knowledge is such that he does know for certain what I'm going to do, but it doesn't affect my free will. And then Raavad in Hasagot and the Glosses says, that is not clever to raise a massive issue and then not to deal with it properly. Famous to a sharp Raavad gloss. So that's but basically Rambam is saying it's not undermining God's omnipotence. We have free will, but God does know everything, including what we're going to do. Ralbag, again, another course best taught by someone else. Ralbag says future contingents are something you can't have knowledge of. In other words, how I'm going to choose tomorrow between 2 options I have is something contingent. It's something that could go one way or another, and it's in the future. And those things, Ralbag argues, are not the objects of proper knowledge. That's not something that's known. It's too vague, too unsaid. It's not known, and God doesn't know. Interesting. It's, I know a friend of mine, acquaintance of mine, got into big trouble for saying it's too loud in the yeshiva. Ralbag says God does not have knowledge. He doesn't know how I'm going to freely choose tomorrow. But again, it doesn't affect his omniscience, because that's not proper knowledge. God has full knowledge of everything to which the term knowledge can properly be applied. So again, everyone's coming down on the side. So omniscience, Morat. Oh gosh, I left myself my injury. Do you have injury time? Injury time in soccer matches. Do 1 minute on 1 minute on moral perfection. Moral perfection. So here, God's moral perfection is asserted again and again in our tradition. Tov Hashem lakol, v'racham alakom, etc., etc. Hatzur tamim pa'olo, God, the rocker's work is perfect, etc. A whole other course would be, what do you do about the morally problematic texts in the Torah and in Tanakh, the Akedah, commandment to wipe out Amalek, etc. Don't know, seems to suggest maybe that God isn't morally perfect.
Who suggests that?
Sorry.
Who suggests?
No, that's you. One might suggest that. One might suggest it's one of the classic reform arguments for Torah not being min hashamayim, that a code of good wouldn't command that. So the best thing I've seen on that is a book called Divine Command Ethics: Jewish and Christian Perspectives. If you ask me afterwards, I'll tell you who the author is. One interesting point is that you never see our tradition dealing with the difficult text in that way. They never say, oh, well, yeah, it's because God isn't good, actually, and so it's no problem. You never see that. So again, evidence that by and large our tradition exists on the goodness of God. You might try something else. You might appeal to what's known in philosophy as divine command theory or divine command morality, roughly the thesis that what God says is moral is moral. God can move the moral goalposts around however he likes. So if God says Abraham sacrifice Yitzchak, that becomes moral. The problem with that approach is that it's not well grounded at all in Jewish tradition, surprisingly enough. Interesting experiment. Here's another dinner party trick. Go into a yeshiva or a SEM, say to people, does God have free choice over what's moral or not? I guarantee most people will say, of course he does. The mainstream position in our Masorah is that he doesn't. Okay, but anyway, another subject. And you never see, most relevant to us, final point, you never see this approach used as an answer to the problem of evil. You could answer the whole problem of evil with this theory. You could say there is no problem of evil because God decides what's good and what isn't, and what appears to us to be evil isn't evil. If God let it happen, it must be good. And interestingly enough, none of the figures who raise the problem of evil in Tanakh or in Talmud or in our sources appeal to that. So it appears that that solution isn't open to us either. And therefore, in conclusion of point 9, God appears in our tradition to be fairly consistently conceived of as omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. And therefore, we're not going to be able to solve the problem of evil by challenging the idea that God has any of these attributes. Okay, so that's cleared the decks for the future Peace God 9 sessions, and thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining today. And I just want to say, just a reminder for people who weren't here this morning, Michal's class is not happening next week. So there's no Parsha class next week. We start at 9:15 next week with the 3 classes that were on deck. If you can, please take one of these and register just that you were here. So I know if you already registered, you don't need to. Timelines come back to me. Sources go to you. And please finish all the food. I just put another plate of fruit out. Please finish it. I don't want to take anything home. Thanks, everybody. Again, and this.